Start recording. Thank you. Welcome all. Welcome to this CSU Green Cities Talk. My name is Anna Rubo. I'm a board member of the Consortium for Sustainable Urbanization and a researcher at Columbia University. I am speaking to you from New York. Our guest, Phoebe Goodwin, joins us from Geneva. Today, it is my great pleasure to welcome folks from around the world to this exciting event. For those joining us for the first time, the CSU mission ranges from increasing awareness about emerging urban issues, facilitating knowledge transfer between and among policy and decision makers, and fostering connections, cooperation, and collaboration, while all the time promoting the UN's 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, and especially Goal 11. Now, CSU seeks to build bridges between the United Nations and civil society, the design professions, business, academia, youth, and allied organizations. We are a nonprofit, volunteer-led organization. We participate in world events, and CSU will be represented at the upcoming UN Habitat World Urban Forum this November. If you're there, please look us up. We invite everyone to visit our CSU website, see our resources, publications, our Green Cities and Green Books talks, and join us for the remaining 2024 events. For anyone taking this for professional development, please review the learning objectives online. Now, turning to today's event. We are especially pleased that our guest today helps us mark World Humanitarian Day and pay tribute to those who have helped improve the lives of refugees. She speaks to us from Geneva. An architect by training, she will talk about her work with the great humanitarian organization, UNHCR, or the Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees. It was established in 1950. Over the decades, UNHCR has brought relief to millions of people. Today, as climate change, displacement, and the global conflicts are increasingly top of mind, this extraordinary organization has its work cut out to meet the challenges. At the end of 2023, for example, the number of people forcibly displaced reached over 117 million. 31.6 million were refugees under UNHCR's mandate. Another 6 million Palestinian refugees were under UNRWA's mandate. Let me now introduce Phoebe Goodwin to you. Phoebe holds a Masters of Architecture from the University of Sydney. She finished her degree in 2011, so she's a young practitioner and has worked in the private sector in Australia and Switzerland. Phoebe's interest in humanitarian work dates to her childhood in Sydney, Australia, but began to take focus after she joined the Global Studio program in Johannesburg in 2008, where students worked with township residents on projects residents said could improve their lives. Her experience in Johannesburg prompted volunteer work with Emergency Architects Australia in the Solomon Islands, the Jack Thompson Foundation in the Northern Territory of Australia, and Global Studio Bhopal. Her postgraduate work experience includes health habitat in Australia and sticky situations in South Africa. Now here I should add a personal note. Before joining Columbia's Centre for Sustainable Urban Development, I taught at the University of Sydney. So I know Phoebe. I was also responsible for running the Global Studio, a program held in 4 countries to help emerging professionals work more effectively with urban poor. So Phoebe joined the program in Joburg as a student and in Bhopal as a very, very useful mentor. To have followed her fearless career has been, for me, a great pleasure. Now, to get back to her bio, in addition to her architecture degree, she completed trainings offered by the International Red Cross and Red Crescent Movement, as well as a master's short course with Oxford Brookes University to equip her with the additional skills needed in the field of humanitarian shelter. In other words, she has supplemented her original academic learning as when needed. Now, since 2016, she has worked with UNHCR as a site planner and shelter officer in Mexico, Uganda, Bangladesh, Jordan, Greece, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. As the mother of a young child, she is currently based in the headquarters in Geneva, where she has shifted from a technical architectural role to general program management at a global scale. Phoebe will introduce us to this remarkable organisation, its role and its work. She will tell us about her experience as an architect with the organisation in various countries and the challenges and the knowledge and skills needed. Following her presentation, we'll have about 10 minutes for a Q&A. Now, please write your questions in the chat box and as we go along, and we will try and get to all of them. Now, if any of you in the audience have your cameras on, could you please turn them off, and could you also mute your computers? So with that, please welcome Phoebe. And Phoebe, the screen is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so indeed, yes, please, Shitra, that's fine. Go to the next slide. Thank you so much for the introduction. Also, thank you to everyone who is here online today, taking your personal time to listen to me ramble on. I hope you won't be bored or disappointed by what you're about to hear. I've also tried to jam in a lot of content, so I'm not quite sure we'll have 10 minutes for Q&A, but let's see how we go. So here's the agenda. We're going to have a look at UNHCR, just give you an overview of what the organisation does, how shelter fits into it, provide you with an overview of my professional work as an architect with UNHCR in several country operations, give a perspective on personal challenges in crises situations, as well as what the relevant skills and knowledge that you can acquire if you wish to pursue architectural humanitarian work. Next, please. So our mandate. UNHCR is based on the 1951 Geneva Refugee Convention, and the core mandate is to ensure the international protection of people forced to flee worldwide. Next slide, please. I'm just going to say next, and then you can, sorry. Okay, so Anna has actually already touched on the statistics, so I won't delve too much into detail there, but at the end of 2023, 1 in every 69 people on this planet, that is 1.5% of the entire world's population, were forcibly displaced, okay? And that's actually nearly double the 1 in 125 people who were displaced a decade ago. So there are year-on-year increases of displacement, forced displacement over the last 12 years, which are quite alarming for various reasons. Next slide. Oh, sorry. Indeed, this is a click your slide. So now we have the definition. Please go through the whole. Yeah. Sorry, I should have. There we go. Okay. So go back one. Sorry, so that they can quickly just see exactly. These are under the umbrella mandate of UNHCR, we support those who are forcibly displaced or stateless. So that includes refugees fleeing conflict or persecution, asylum seekers who are seeking international protection in another country, stateless people, individuals who don't actually have a nationality and cannot, achieve and benefit from their human rights. Then internally displaced people who seek safety in other parts of their home country, of their citizenship, nationality, as well as returnees. So people who have been displaced to another country and then they're returning to their home country. Next. Sorry. All right. So what does UNHCR do? We respond to emergencies, crises, situations, early onset. Within 72 hours, UNHCR can mobilize supplies for 1 million people and deploy expert staff to protect people forced to flee. In addition, UNHCR has worked with more than 100 countries to interpret and apply legal standards to ensure that refugees can exercise their rights. In addition to that, we need to look for longer-term solutions, so building better futures, helping over the last decade, almost 1 million refugees rebuild their lives in new countries. Next. So where do we work and how? We're present, UNHCR is present in 136 different countries. At the moment, there's a workforce of over 19,000 people, and 87% of them are based in country operations in the field, while 13% are in headquarters. Of that 13%, there are 7% in Geneva, which is where I'm currently based. And UNHCR works with partners a lot, over 1,000 of them, and that includes non-government organizations, government organizations, community-based organizations, and other non-profit organizations, as well as the private sector, of course. And indeed, we also have a role to play when it comes to interagency and intergovernmental coordination. So that's a quick overview. I'm sorry, I'm going through these quickly because there are a lot of slides to cover. Okay, next, thanks, Shitra. Just to touch on an important point that Anna wanted me to highlight is that indeed UNHCR is very, very aware of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. And there are two core principles of the 2030 Agenda that are about ensuring human rights for all and ensuring that the plan of action, reaches everyone. So the leave no one behind approach. So this means that the international community has agreed to make a concerted effort to identify and lift those who are most vulnerable. And this obviously corresponds very closely with UNHCR's mandate to protect refugees and the displaced, who are clearly among the most vulnerable people around the world. So to effectively achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, it's really important to improve the situation of refugees, internally displaced and stateless people, and to implement sustainable solutions, particularly in conflict-affected regions. And also, we see that more and more, the countries that are hosting refugees are those countries that are less developed, less affluent, shall we say, from a Western lens perspective, and definitely need greater support to be able to ensure that their populations and the refugee populations they're hosting are adequately protected and can enjoy the rights that they deserve. Now, in 2022, just to touch on the fact that UNHCR actually introduced a new results-based management approach to its work and has a global results framework, which is taken in very much due consideration of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So the new UNHCR results structure has 3 levels of results at the impact, outcome, and output levels. I won't delve into details, but it's just to say that country operations, they develop a multi-year results framework, which is at the core of their multi-year operational strategy. And then this results framework is linked to the global results framework by using global impact and outcome areas, as well as also mandatory global core indicators. At the impact and outcome level, 16 of UNHCR's core indicators align very closely with the Sustainable Development Goal indicators. So we're actually able to track progress against the Sustainable Development Goals indicators as well through our work at the country and global level. Next. So, as an international and humanitarian organization, we follow 4 guiding principles. That is humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. However, of course, let's not leave the white elephant in the room silenced. Refugee and nationality issues are often incredibly politicized. Next, please. Okay, so UNHCR has to work balancing between being able to respond rapidly in an emergency response. We have 7 warehouses with pre-positioned emergency stockpiles of aid supplies around the world. And we can respond to a new large-scale emergency or multiple emergencies affecting over 600,000 people within that 72-hour window. But in parallel to that, it's really important that we ensure adequate accountability to the affected displaced populations, as well as donors and member states. Next. Now let's get down to the architectural side of things, shall we? What is shelter for UNHCR? Clearly not this image, right? So basically, it's a vital survival mechanism in times of crisis or displacement. I always talk of shelter as being a tangible physical form of protection, because we always say that UNHCR is the refugee protection agency for refugees. And I see, and as do many colleagues and people around the world, see shelter as a tangible physical form of protection. So it needs to provide a secure and healthy living environment with privacy and dignity for the inhabitants. Ideally, Shelter is where materials are sustainably sourced, locally available, and also taking on board what is the construction methods and approaches that are normally used by the displaced populations themselves or the local hosting population. So not trying to superimpose a neo-colonial approach to shelter. Next, please. UNHCR does have a number of minimum emergency shelter standards, which is really important to ensure that we do have a harmonized approach across all of our operations around the world. So I'm sorry I didn't provide these in the US metric system. My sincerest apologies, but minimum 3.5 meters squared of covered living space per person in the warm climates, okay? And it doesn't include cooking facilities because it's assumed that in such climates, the cooking would be outside. And then you need a minimum height of 2 meters at the highest point internally. For cold climates, the minimum is increased to 4.5 meters squared, up to 5.5 per person, because this includes the kitchen facilities, assuming that more time would be spent inside in such cold climates. So those are just some of the absolute core minimum standards that we try to strive by, regardless of the location. Next. So where are forcibly displaced people sheltered? More than 6.6 million refugees and people in refugee-like situations live in camps, okay? So, and among them, there's about 4.6 million who are in planned managed camps, while 2 million are in self-settled camps. However, since there are over 26 million refugees worldwide, where do they go? And for the most part, they stay in urban areas. Okay, they share accommodation or they live in non-functional public buildings, collective centres, informal settlements, existing informal settlements, and conditions in these urban areas are often substandard. And providing shelter, UNHCR's ability to provide shelter to forcibly displaced people in urban areas can be incredibly challenging. Next. So indeed, this is just a quick overview of some of the common challenges that UNHCR faces when it comes to humanitarian shelter support. Very limited budgets, and also the need to balance and fight for the shelter funds against other colleagues in different sectors, for example, protection, where they provide more software components of assistance. And so, yeah, it can be really hard to push for a decent budget for a shelter response, especially when funds are already limited as it is, but between other various competing sectors as well and looking at the priorities. Indeed, there's also often a lack of approved spaces or buildings for use. Governments do not allow certain buildings or spaces to be occupied by refugees, asylum seekers, etc. So there can be blockages there. Plus making sure that the spaces are indeed culturally appropriate and accepted by host communities, which really requires a participatory design approach to ensure that cultural norms and expectations are met. As well as that, being able to provide rapid emergency solutions that are equally durable and of adequate high enough quality to last possibly for a longer term period. Next. Okay, so now I'm going to jump to my personal experience just to give you an idea of what an architect can and has done with UNHCR. So I started in mid-2015 when I became a UN volunteer. I started my paid employment with UNHCR. I'd previously done an unpaid internship in Geneva, and that sent me running home broke with my tail between my legs. But indeed, I finally got a paid position in 2015. It's a misleading title because I was not technically a volunteer. I got a small salary, which was enough to survive on. Anyway, so my role was Associate Shelter Officer based in Goma in the east of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And so I was responsible for coordinating all of UNHCR's Eastern DRC shelter response efforts. And I was able to gain exposure to UNHCR's activities across numerous different population groups because the Congo had internally displaced communities, refugee returnees, so Congolese refugees that had been sheltered in other countries returning to the Congo, and also Burundian refugees, because there was a political crisis in Burundi at that time. So I supported 6 UNHCR field officers with implementing shelter works. And I also represented UNHCR in interagency field missions for rapid needs assessments. So, for example, in the photo on the left, we had to do a rapid assessment of an internally displaced settlement that had been burnt down by arson. And it was only reachable by helicopter due to its incredibly remote location and unwieldy terrain. Next, please. So here's an example of a transitional shelter, so not an emergency shelter, but more of a transitional shelter for vulnerable Congolese returnees who had returned from neighboring Rwanda, and they had found that their original homes, their land had been taken over by other occupants, and so these targeted vulnerable returnees required support to reintegrate back into society and to be able to rebuild their lives again in the Congo. So my role was to inspect that the construction was completed satisfactorily and that the shelter could be handed over to the returnees so they could make it their home. I have to say I was not a fan of using corrugated iron sheeting in the Congolese climate. I came to the operation before the specifications for this project had been decided. And I did try while I was there to shift the interagency shelter working group their position on CGI to promote other locally sourced and thermally beneficial materials for roofing. But that was quite tough because CGI is seen as upmarket and the stylish Western option in the Congo, which both host communities and also, people in need of humanitarian assistance, they desire CGI. So I won't delve into detail again, but in humanitarian responses, there is an interagency coordination mechanism, which enables different UN, NGO, and other civil society actors who are implementing activities to get together on a regular basis, establish harmonized standards for response efforts, and to avoid any gaps or duplications in assistance. So, for example, harmonized standards would be the selection criteria for targeted shelter support, as well as the actual technical specifications for the shelters being built. So just as in a basic example, it would cause more harm than good if some families, comprising 5 people each, received a shelter with a footprint of 25 meters squared, while other families, also each with 5 people within each family, in the same region, received a shelter of 15 meters squared. So 10 meter squared difference. That would really not be fair. It could create conflict, etc. So the do no harm principle is very important, and it feeds into interagency coordination. Next, please. So some missions involved, back please, Shitra. Yeah. Some missions involved changing tires as the roads were incredibly rough. But we also had to be very careful because rebel groups were very active in the region, and getting out of the car was a no-go in many areas. The image on the right just illustrates that UNHCR's returnee shelter project also involved support to build a separate pit latrine structure near their shelter. Next, please. So after saying goodbye to Goma, I spent 9 months in Greece in 2016 as a site planner. Which is basically, I think you could equate that to an urban planner. And also I was the national coordinator for the shelter and non-food items sector working group. So sector working group as in for interagency coordination. And non-food items essentially means household items like blankets, sleeping mats, jerry cans for water storage, etc. This was actually an emergency response as Greece had seen the number of sea arrivals from Turkey amount to approximately 850,000 people in 2015. And then in the first 6 months of 2016, there were a further 156,000 new arrivals, which Greece had never had to deal with before. So people were on the move, and the number of asylum seekers who actually remained in Greece fluctuated while I was there around the 50 to 60,000 mark. Based in Athens, I led sector working group initiatives, such as a communal kitchen strategy, practical shelter and site planning measures to mitigate the risk of gender-based violence, heating solutions for different shelter typologies, and as well as a contingency plan in case there would be an additional new influx from Turkey. These images, you can see that there was a spontaneous self-settlement, believe it or not, at a petrol station in northern Greece towards the border with North Macedonia. And below is an image of a sports stadium in Athens that was also occupied. So next, please. It was quite a unique humanitarian response, I have to say. Sometimes I had to travel a lot being based in Athens, but I was providing roving support. I had to fly a lot to the islands up north to Thessaloniki, and sometimes I'd be on a flight with lots of tourists getting ready to go and have a rowdy time on Mykonos or Ios. So it was a bizarre juxtaposition. And here is actually, an image of one of the displacement sites, in Thessaloniki. And they were spread out all across Greece, managed by the Greek army or the navy, depending on the location. Next, please. So we also worked on displacement site upgrade proposals where they were urgently needed and prioritized by the operation. So here is just an example of a site plan for 172 accommodation containers. So basically this displacement site was being upgraded from tents to prefabricated containers in order to house families. And this is a site plan I developed. It included buildings and locations for other services, such as communal laundries, a dining hall, distribution centre, women and men's centres, classrooms, and also actually a communal garden. And this was occupying an existing Greek military site, a base. So we were having to repurpose and work around some of their existing administration buildings. Next, please. As part of this tender package for this upgrade, we also developed drawings and various technical specifications, bills of quantities, etc., for the accommodation containers themselves with their furniture layout. And we also had the specifications for connecting these containers to existing water, wastewater, sewage, and electricity networks in Athens. So again, I'm just touching on some of the level of technical details that are required for certain response efforts. Okay, next, please. UNHCR supported the efforts to provide accommodation containers in Lesvos Island. And so after I designed their site plan, I oversaw the delivery and installation of these containers on site. However, just juxtaposing that with the image to the right, the shelter conditions did vary significantly from site to site and between the islands and the mainland, so it wasn't always feasible to actually improve them due to a number of factors, limited budget, and also lack of government support. One site, for example, was actually established in a former pig tannery, and despite UNHCR and other partners' best efforts to advocate for a different site, the Greek government still did send asylum seekers there to occupy tents temporarily. So yeah, it was quite a politicized response. Okay, next slide, please. Then at the start of 2017, I became head of Mafraq's shelter, site planning and energy units in Jordan, based out of the Zaatari refugee camp, where I supervised one architect and 2 electrical engineers. And we were responsible for managing the camp's live master plan, for instigating and supervising particular infrastructure projects, also interagency coordination for construction projects, and for developing a humanitarian exit shelter strategy. By the time I arrived, Zaatari was almost 5 years old as a camp, and it was home to approximately 80,000 Syrian refugees, which made it the world's largest camp for Syrian refugees. This is a photo here of the famous main market road in Zaatari, which is nicknamed the Champs-Élysées, and it's basically the main high street for the entire camp. And it's quite remarkable. This camp has grown into its own incredibly productive, colourful village. Next, please. So this is an example of one of the plans pulled from the live master plan for Zaatari, highlighting the key infrastructure and facilities, such as health facilities, community centres, the solar power plant, etc. And just to give you an idea, so Zaatari has an area of approximately 2 square miles, so 5.2 square kilometres. And it's only 7.5 miles, which is approximately 12 kilometres from the Syrian border. So many of the Syrian families living in Zaatari actually used to occupy Syrian territory just over the border. The site also used to be a military airstrip. And actually, while I was working there, an unexploded ordnance, a UXO, was discovered due to excavations for the piped water and wastewater network project that was being implemented by UNICEF. So this site, from a UNHCR site planning perspective, ticked many red lines in the sense that it should not have been where a refugee camp should be established due to its proximity to the border with Syria, possibility of UXOs, etc. But if the government says this is where refugees are going, and despite UNHCR's advocacy and best efforts, if they can't push back, have to work with what you're given effectively in host countries, because they hold the primary responsibility to look after and to protect refugees and asylum seekers on their soil. Next, please. I'm running out of time, aren't I? Golly. Okay. Here, we strove to actually increase the involvement of refugees in the design and implementation of projects. So this is an example of where UNHCR and partners provided Syrian refugee artists with paint, who then led an initiative to lift the spirits of the camp, all the camp residents, and bring a splash of colour to their lives. So young refugee residents also contributed to the designs and the actual painting works, reflecting, as you can see, cultural traditions, popular interests for Syrians in Zaatari. It was a really fun and successful project that led, clearly to a beautiful and really creative result. And also residents were able to add a unique identity to their homes, which was, able to build pride for them. Next, please. Here are some examples of incredible ingenuity, improvisation, and also clear innovation of the Syrian refugees themselves. Okay, this is through no humanitarian external support. They took the initiative to personalize and upgrade the containers that were provided to them. So prefabricated containers that are usually used as offices, for example, on construction sites, they were donated by the Gulf states. So initially the camp was tented, UNHCR family tents, people were residing in them, eventually upgraded to prefab containers. And then from there, Syrian refugee residents personalized, improved, and as you can see from these images, they sourced materials to create gardens. Next slide, please. Build furniture, internal courtyards, etc. And actually, one man even, I don't have an image of this, but one, bless his soul, one man used a container and converted it into a small swimming pool for kids to play in during the extreme summer heat. But unfortunately, this alarmed, and understandably too, many humanitarian actors due to the water consumption for the pool, even though he had paid for the extra supply. So unfortunately, the pool was dismantled. It didn't last long, but some kids did get to swim in it. Next, please. Okay, so from October 2017, I was sent on emergency mission to Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh to support the highest emergency level response, that's level 3 for UNHCR, to the Rohingya refugee influx. So there was a mass influx of over 500,000 refugees in the space of just a few months, which meant that these new arrivals spontaneously self-settled on any square centimetre of land that they could find without being expelled by Bangladeshi authorities. Next, please. So the Rohingya refugees built their own shelters with cut-down tree branches, sticks, and also the plastic sheets which humanitarian agencies distributed, like UNHCR, IOM, and others. However, they settled in a very dense format without any real spatial planning. There were no areas designated for fire breaks, for roads, water points, communal latrines or showers, health and educational facilities, etc. And also there's a national park to the east of the main settlement. And the retrieval of all these tree branches, also used for firewood for cooking, meant that there was major deforestation occurring and encroaching on this protected national park. So my objectives with site planning here were to insert equitably distributed infrastructure and services, communal services, for all of these smaller communities of Rohingya refugees, and also to overlay some order to the informal, spontaneous sprawl of household shelters that was growing day by day. And this design process involved many site visits, recording GPS data, pegging out sites, as you can see in this photo, using aerial images and drawing up plan proposals in AutoCAD. I also obviously had regular consultations with other agencies and partners who were planning to build or operate the new infrastructure and services that were going to be established in these settlement zones. Next, please. There were crises within crises for this emergency response, and there continues to be so to this day. But while I was there were accidental fires, which caused newly built shelters to be destroyed, as well as flooding and landslides due to the monsoon season. In addition, because of the main settlement's location, very close to a national park, there's also the presence of an endangered species of elephant in the region. And its migratory route actually crosses over the main settlement. So there were elephant attacks and fatalities while I was in Bangladesh, which subsequently led to special teams of refugees being established to be on the lookout at night in watchtowers for elephants. And there was also a lot of information awareness campaigns for the communities in order to understand what to do in case a herd of elephants wanders in their direction. But despite all this, the Rohingyas, pushed through with incredible strength, and they endeavored to build back better with the support of the humanitarian community and carry on. So, yeah, incredible strength and resilience. Next, please. So amidst the site planning responsibilities, there were times where I had to take on other roles. For example, due to the continued influx of new arrivals, overcrowding at the transit and reception centres was inevitable. And because of that, some people had to be temporarily sheltered in schools, which prevented these schools from being used for actual educational purposes. This was obviously not an ideal long-term solution, so we had to act fast to relocate these new arrivals to vacant plots of lands and decongest the schools by providing them with emergency shelter kits. So I assisted with distributing the emergency shelter kits and actually physically accompanying the new arrivals, these families, to the land, to the plots allocated for them, so that they could then erect their emergency shelters. And that was an incredibly rewarding experience to be able to be part of that distribution process and to see these people be able to leave the school and, be provided with the materials to build an emergency shelter. And then to the right, you can see sometimes I was actually accosted for interviews and had to answer a few quick questions on the spot. Because, the scale of this particular response was unprecedented. It did receive a lot of media attention. Next, please. My main contribution was actually initiating the development of a macro-scale site planning tool for the main Rohingya refugee settlement. There were a number of refugee settlements south of Cox's Bazar towards the border with Myanmar, but this macro settlement development plan focused on the main settlement and its extensions. Because basically what had happened was IOM, the International Organization for Migration, and UNHCR had split up the coordination and response efforts within the main settlement by zones or camps. And this was leading to siloed activities on the ground, using different activities without zooming out to look at the broader picture of ensuring a harmonized and equitable implementation of aid. So the emergency response needed a longer-term plan to work in harmony with the immediate short-term assistance being delivered. So this macro settlement development plan, which we abbreviated, as we love to use acronyms in the UN, known as the MSDP, was meant to be a live planning and advocacy tool to illustrate by theme the existing conditions and the intended or required long-term services and infrastructure common to one or more camps in this particular settlement. So we wanted to assist government and other humanitarian agencies to identify the gaps or address any potential future duplication of service provision. So it strove to map out and illustrate the multi-sector interagency strategic vision for improving the living conditions and longevity of the Rohingya settlements. Next, please. Thanks to this macro settlement development plan, we were able to determine the key infrastructure needs for the main Rohingya refugee settlement. So by, towards the end of 2017, we knew the length of roads that still needed to be constructed, the distribution sites that were required, production wells, land for fecal sludge management, etc., etc. And we obviously had population data and the total site area. Again, sorry, it's all metric, but I can always, convert later if desired. Next, please. I'm really running out of time. I'm only at Uganda. Okay, so then for 18, I could go an extra 5 minutes over, but then anyway, I apologize. I ramble. This is my issue. For 18 months from April 2018, I was head of the Shelter and Site Planning Unit for UNHCR's largest operation at the time in Uganda. So there were over 1.1 million refugees in Uganda, mostly coming from South Sudan and from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So I provided technical managerial oversight to a team of field-based engineers and architects, which initially amounted to over 20 staff, but with budget cuts, I sadly saw the team shrink over time while I was there. And we were implementing various construction projects from refugee shelters to roadworks across the 30 different refugee settlements that exist in Uganda. And I was also co-chair of the Interagency Humanitarian Shelter, Settlements and Non-Food Items Working Group. Okay, next slide, please. I'm going to try and speed this up. So some missions involve the inspection of activities being implemented on the ground, such as here you'll see the distribution of emergency shelter kits and household items in the Chaka settlement for Congolese refugees in southwest Uganda. This distribution reached almost 200 families in one day. And I needed to check that, the distribution was progressing well in accordance with the standard operating procedures. All items the refugees were eligible to receive were being provided and that they adhered to the required technical standards. So these emergency shelter kits included wooden poles to use as a structural frame, to then take UNHCR plastic tarps as cladding. So that was how these kits were designed. And I had to make sure that the diameter of the poles was in line with the minimum specified diameter to ensure adequate structural strength. Next, please. I also built the content for the Office of the Prime Minister's Settlement Planning and Shelter Guidelines, as well as pushed for a new shelter strategy to be approved by the government in order to facilitate community-based, owner and market-driven support. So bottom-up approach, provide cash to refugees to facilitate choice, self-resilience, etc. And we also piloted this new shelter strategy with our NGO partners, the NGO partner Catholic Relief Services. So the three images in the top left are the shelter conditions prior. So unfortunately, shocking shelter conditions, but some refugee families were indeed occupying shelters like this, and they were targeted and selected for the program and ended up with shelters that looked like the one in the bottom right corner, as you can see, with the mud bricks and the CGI roofing. I did want to touch on the guiding principles that we established for all shelter actors, but I don't think we have much time. But we just wanted to make sure, for example, that there was no provision of individual assistance at the expense of community dynamics and self-resilience. So village level responsibility and accountability to their most vulnerable members shall be pursued. harmonized prioritization for beneficiary selection, and the project must be as environmentally sustainable as possible, as well as cost effective as possible. There are other guiding principles, but really running out of time. Next, please. Okay. Final country operation, Mexico. So I moved to Mexico City after Uganda in October 2019 and worked as the head of the technical unit for UNHCR there for 18 months. I managed a team of 3 and was responsible for overseeing all the construction projects in the country. It's mostly an urban response where UNHCR improves, expands existing permanent infrastructure to facilitate the adequate accommodation of refugees and migrants. Albergues, which is Spanish for hostel or lodge, they're run by local churches or charities to enable the brief transitory accommodation of refugees and migrants who are on the move north towards the beloved US of A. And many of these albergues have been in place for years, but saw an increase in demand in the recent years with the Venezuelan crisis and other increased political, economic, and social instability in countries like Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala. So in Mexico, rather than with NGO partners like Catholic Relief Services in Uganda, here we worked with commercial Mexican contractors for these construction projects. So I had to create the technical package for local tenders, for the competitive bidding and technical evaluations of private Mexican construction companies. Next, please. So this was another role where, although I was based in Mexico City, I was traveling a lot to the field locations where these albergues and other communal services are located in order to try to manage the construction projects on site, despite my shocking Spanish. Next, please. COVID did strike while I was in Mexico, so the site visits were far less regular than they should have been. And especially considering some of the big projects did have budgets each of over $1 million US, which is really significant for UNHCR. So, for example, this new albergue, UNHCR was financing its construction in Monterrey. Top left image. Next, please. Oh, golly. I have to leave also because my son's at creche and they'll kick him out if I don't go and pick him up. So, personal challenges. Here we go. Yes, long hours. It's grueling, especially in an, sudden crisis, the early days of an emergency. You are working pretty much 24/7. And there is a lot of pressure and stress in order to be able to perform and deliver as quickly as possible. The deadline is always yesterday in these situations. And indeed, of course, whether the humanitarian response is as a result of conflict or climate, you are working in insecure environments. You don't necessarily have the family, friend support that you would normally have in a non-crisis condition. And there are no creature comforts. But my approach, suck it up. If this is the kind of work you want to do, then obviously you need to modify your expectations and you need to be willing not to be able to, spend your weekends sipping pina coladas on a beach. Not to say that that is necessarily anyone's cup of tea here on this call, but I'm just saying that indeed I think also personal challenges can be overcome and there are other ways to manage stress and anxiety and work through these conditions that are out of one's comfort zone. Next, please. So here, just some, I think, key skills and knowledge that would be ideal if you would like to pursue humanitarian architecture. Firstly, of course, you've got to be motivated, believe in the cause, be interested in social, environmental, and economic justice. I personally think it's really important that no one compromises on quality, okay? People in need of humanitarian assistance deserve just as high quality design standards as wealthy private clients. Now, obviously, budgets and resources eventually will not lead to 3-story mansions being built for refugees and asylum seekers, but within the parameters that you have to work with, I still think it's really important to try to strive for just as high quality as possible. Then, of course, different cultures, religions, people's histories, their stories, intergenerational traumas, etc. They entail diverse needs and also sometimes opposing. So it's important to have sensitivity to that. You're working with multicultural teams for possibly multicultural clientele, etc. So it's important to take that into consideration. Plus, you need to be able to improvise and innovate with limited resources. You're never going to get enough budget and you're never going to have enough time. Please be flexible, adaptable, and curious. So rigidity it won't fly because nothing ever goes as originally planned, and you really do need to be open to new ideas. Keep your eyes and ears peeled, as the saying goes, to be able to course correct and make modifications as you work. And then it's good to have a knowledge of interdisciplinary concerns. So, having worked with UNHCR now, I feel like I'm definitely far from being a lawyer, but I have a bit of an understanding of, from the softer side of protection, what that means, and also the health needs, immediate urgent health needs, educational needs, food and water, etc., other sectors beyond just core architecture, as well as how to design for, an appropriate legacy of your project. Okay. So after you're long gone, after you've left, what is the longer term impact and influence of the architectural intervention that you've left behind? Having knowledge of the Sustainable Development Goals is obviously great, and skills in participatory planning and design, which, will lead me to the fact that, next slide, please. Global Studio did, one. Sorry, the cleaner just walked in and started vacuuming, and I didn't think that was a great idea. So, Global Studio. Anna's already touched on my involvement. As you know, its aim is to educate design professionals differently and to develop useful participatory design and planning skills. So, important lessons for humanitarian work on this diagram, listen, collaborate with affected communities, adapt solutions, and develop trust. Next, questions and answers, which I unfortunately don't think I have time for, and I'm so sorry to go over time. I hope that was coherent, Anna.
Yes. Well, I'm sorry too, and I think, Phoebe, we will have to invite you back for another session, because this has been a trip through an extraordinary body of work over extraordinarily important questions. And I am utterly aware that your 3-year-old now takes precedence and that you have to get to the childcare centre. So there have been some great questions and some great comments and some very heartfelt thanks to you on the chat. I hope Chitra can take a copy of the chat so we can pass it on to you. But with that, because I do know you have to go, I would like to just say a very warm thanks on behalf of CSU to you, Phoebe, for an extraordinary talk about such a critical issue, and which, given the statistics you started out with and all the issues we are all aware of, this is only going to be a growing and very, very vital concern as we go forward. And people like you, who have come out of an architectural sort of background and have been adaptable and so flexible to working in new ways, I think you will provide something of a role model for other people doing this and other people who will seek your advice. So with that, I would like to close out the session and thank you very, very much for joining us today. And to all of you online, thank you. I've got one message which I'll read out from Janice Perlman, who I do know has worked so extensively in Brazil. Thank you so much for sharing this inspiring talk, and please let us know how to contribute and how to see this show slowly. So thank you, Janice, for that comment. I think everybody would probably like to see that. I think what we will do is we will post the recording, Toot Sweet, on the CSU site, and we will ask Phoebe to send us the slideshow, and we will post the slideshows also on the CSU site. So everybody can go through at their leisure and take in all this sort of extraordinary sort of amount of information that you provided. Okay, thanks so much, Phoebe, and little Arlo calls. So
no, thank you so much. And indeed, I would be very happy at a later stage to answer questions. So if you do share the ones that came up in the chat, I can try and provide some written responses later. Sincerest apologies that I did move through the slides so quickly. I should have reduced the number of slides. But anyway, thanks for listening. And yeah, I am available.
And we'll give you a shout out, Phoebe, from Karen Kubi, who you do know. Johannesburg friends. Anyway, thanks a lot, and thank you all for attending. I found this utterly stimulating. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.